Hey everybody, a warm welcome to you all to this video time-lapse of a Cyberpunk Edgerunners piece that I just finished. Hope you're doing well wherever you are in the world. My name is Colin, and without further ado, I'll take you through it. So, when I start these kinds of illustrations, I try to start with an idea in mind. If you guys are familiar with the show, with Cyberpunk Edgerunners, then you guys have an idea of what happens, what goes on, what the characters do, what the conflict is. And if you've seen it, then you might have a good idea of maybe, if you wanted to do a piece or do some fan art, do an illustration, what might be suitable for something like this. And so when I was going through that thought process, the first thing that my brain thought of, which is not often what I go with, but in this case it was, I wanted to do a classic Drew Struzan type movie poster for it. There's a lot of other types of illustrations that you could do for something like this if you were so inclined. But I like the idea of a classic movie poster. It seems to work. It's similar to the marketing art that they did for the series as well. There's a few other things that, I could have done, but I like the idea of movie posters. They're fun. And so the first thing I do when I start any piece like this is just you get into the meat of the drawing and you just do a thumbnail. In the thumbnail, what we're focusing on primarily is composition, perspective, character posing, the overall kind of energy of the piece that I want to get across. And there's a lot of push and pull. There's a lot of things that change. There's a lot of things that I kind of go back and forth on. But what I'm doing here is I'm trying to surround our main character in the middle with basically as many other characters as I can, with like kind of varying sizes depending on importance or just depending on composition. What I ended up with was David Martinez standing basically right there in the middle, bracketed by Lucy on the left and Maine on the right, because the two of them are, at least in my opinion, based on what I've seen and thought of the show, they're kind of the most important characters overall, other than David, with maybe the exception of Rebecca, who we're going to get in a little bit later. But the other thing about a movie poster type thing that I was kind of thinking about as I was doing this is that you don't typically get a whole lot of really, really dynamic poses with something like that. It's basically just a bunch of floating heads usually. But what I wanted to do is something like that, but still add a little bit of dynamism in the character poses, as long as they're not David, because I wanted him to be very, not static, not rigid or anything. But he's kind of our main guy. He's standing there. He's looking right at us. He's looking badass. Everybody else gets, gets to have a little bit more dynamism in what they're doing and kind of how they're posed and how they're standing. The other thing is that what I plan on doing is using all of the compositional tricks that I know in order to pop David out as much as possible. Whereas the other characters, because they don't get all those tricks, I use dynamic posing to kind of make them a little bit more interesting. So I am now through all of the rough drawings for these characters. We are going to add some more characters later because I decided to add the rest of the cast, after I'd finished all the line art for these guys. But right now, at this point, I was like, okay, you know what? We're good. We're good with our four main most important characters, plus Smasher up there is kind of the overarching looming villain. Now I'm going to get into the line art because I think I'm ready, even though later I decided, no, we're not quite ready. We're going to add some more characters. So here, this is about as far as I go usually with thumbnails. Sometimes I'll figure out anatomy and posing a little bit more. Sometimes I'll do a little bit more research on their clothing. Sometimes I'll just do maybe a couple of failed line art passes before I get into it. But in this case, I was pretty comfortable and confident just moving ahead. I was like, you know what? I think it's time. I think it's ready. Let's get this done. So here, what I'm doing is I'm going over the sketch, and I'm not necessarily beholden to any one part of it. I'm willing to change just about anything, and I do. You guys will see in a little bit how radically different some of the stuff becomes. But I'm going through and detailing out the drapery, the clothing detail, and trying to also pay attention to posing and anatomy as I kind of go along doing that. I'm not going for a final line art pass because I actually work on the lines for all these characters kind of right up until the end of the piece, but this is predominantly when most of it gets done. A lot's going to change. We'll lasso some stuff. We'll move some stuff around. David was probably the character that probably changed the least. So let's see, what else can I talk about? Right now, I'm drawing his shoes, which I was looking off to my screen right monitor constantly for because these costume designs are really, really cool, but they're pretty intricate, so you got to be constantly staring at reference. What I typically do, you can see my my fat, ugly mug down there in the bottom right corner when I was streaming this. I am constantly looking over at reference and, talking to myself, talking to the stream, and also making sure that everything is kind of the way that I like it to be. Here's a little trick that I use sometimes when I like to speed things up. I'll grab a 3D model either off a Sketchfab or maybe Free 3D or TurboSquid or whatever, or I'll model something myself very, very quickly. But given that this is fan art, given that this is for Cyberpunk, and given that this is, I believe, an existing weapon, or at least it's somewhat similar to what David uses, so I just basically grabbed a model, threw it in Blender, or I think in this case I just posed it on Sketchfab, screenshotted it, threw it into the piece, got the majority of the perspective down, changed the design a little bit, and that's it. Was done. I wouldn't shy away from doing that kind of stuff if you guys are doing your own pieces, but there are a few things to keep in mind if you do stuff like that. Because you're drawing over it, you're pretty much safe, but what I like to do is to change the design a little bit, you know, not necessarily beholden to just tracing it over. And I'd be a little bit more careful about doing that kind of stuff if you're doing client work or if you're doing your own work. You know, we should be using your own designs. But if it's for fan art and if it's just a little fun thing like this, you know, use all the reference that you think you need because, you know, it'll probably benefit the piece in the long run. So here I am starting to laser in a little bit more on his expression. I also decided to not have him standing on a dumpster. I was like, it's Cyberpunk. He needs to be on some, like, insanely awesome supercar, even though we can't really fit a lot of it in, but we can allude to what he's standing on. So I grabbed an old model that I had, screenshotted it, threw it in, nice and simple, you know, draw over it, and then you're done. That'll come in a lot more later in the piece, and I'll kind of explain the process behind that as well. So here, I'm still messing with the head shape, still messing with the expression, still messing with the placement of the features, trying to make sure that even though the pose is static, he really is, you know, looking as badass as we can possibly make him, because he's a cyberpunk boy. So, let's see, we're still fixing line art. Here is something that I like to do when I've done the initial line art pass on a character, especially in something like this. And I do this with storyboards as well, but it's important for really highly compositional pieces like this. I'll finish the line art and I'll close all the gaps between the lines, and then I'll throw in a flat tone behind the character, which serves two purposes. Number one, it pops out their silhouette, so I can, if I zoom back, their silhouette in the piece is a lot more obvious to me, rather than if they were just made of lines. The other thing is that is the layer that we're going to clip all future layers down onto. The color layers, the black shadow layers, the two-tone layers, all the effects layers, all of the layers that belong to David are going to be clipped down to that one gray layer that we just started right there. And now we're getting into Lucy's line art. And what I like to do, especially with characters that are fairly close to camera in pieces like this, is even if the majority of Lucy, or part of her body, is behind David, I'll still go in and I'll still draw a decent chunk, or maybe even her entire pose, even things that are hidden, because when I get into the later stages of pieces like this, there's a ton of moving around and resizing and changing and lasso tooling and redrawing and stuff like that. And having more or all of the pose drawn, even if it's not all going to be seen, is way more useful. Number one, because if you're going to draw a pose, you may as well draw the whole thing. It's good practice. But also, if it moves, then you want to draw the whole thing so you don't have to redraw stuff if you find an area that when you move a character out from behind another character, if half their leg isn't drawn, then, well, you got to draw the leg. So with Maine and Lucy here, we're watching Maine be redrawn very, very quickly right now. Both of them, I made sure that their entire pose was put together, and I think the same thing was true for both Adam Smasher and Rebecca, who's going to be coming up in a few minutes. So same thing here with Maine. I was focused fairly heavily on some reference that I had on my side monitors. And because I had never drawn these characters before, it was like this was the first and hopefully not the last time I drawn them. I was figuring a lot of this stuff out as I was going. And as you can see, a lot of this stuff with Maine I had not roughed out. I was basically doing, you know, one-to-one, like with I had thumbnailed where I wanted him on the page, but I hadn't figured anything else out. Like that arm, had no idea. And as you guys can see, there's a couple of basic anatomy problems right now because I hadn't roughed this thing out. I just kind of went for it. The shoulder is kind of too crushed into the traps, and it's squeezing the chest in. Later I'll fix that. And here's another example of when I found his exact shotgun from the game, and I was like, well, let's screenshot the model, let's throw it in, let's trace over the parts we need, let's change it where it needs to be changed, and we're done, moving on. It's the kind of thing that maybe in years past I would have plotted out, figured out myself. At this point, though, if it's a cyberpunk piece and if it's a cyberpunk gun and it's something the character's actually holding, I'll find a 3D model, I'll screenshot it. I won't feel any shame for doing so. It's perfectly normal. And to be honest, if it was my own IP that I was drawing, then I would be modeling my own weapons, my own robots, my own creatures, whatever, and throwing them in as reference as well. In fact, you guys will probably see that in other time-lapse videos that we go over. So here as well, I'm drawing a lot of stuff that will not be seen in the final image. Doesn't matter. I think it's good practice. And there, I've fixed the shoulder, and I'm changing the proportions of his whole body, but that's just how things go. I think actually I'm probably going to bump him up in a little bit and draw more of his legs. Figuring out his jacket, making sure all those details are in there, all those cool cyber muscles he's placed all over himself. And we don't see much of that other arm, fortunately, so I just kind of threw in a couple of lines to allude to the fact that, yeah, he's holding the front of the gun, but we don't need to see it because it's not there. If it's off the page, then I, probably won't draw that, even though if it's on the page, I will strive to draw, at least a decent amount of the pose. Again, depending on how close to camera it is and depending on how much I think it'll probably move and change. So now we're getting into Rebecca, and I think there was a pause there because I was staring at some reference for a little bit. So in her case, because she's higher up, and because with the other characters, they weren't super dynamic, I was like, well, Rebecca's kind of crazy, and she does lots of crazy stuff, so let's give her by far one of the craziest poses in the whole kind of thing. So here as well, as you can see, I don't really do a whole lot of figuring out with the thumbnail anymore. It's more just to get something down, get the character placed, and then the rest of it, the posing, the anatomy, the drapery, the giant-ass sweater that she's wearing, all that stuff, I will either figure it out during the line art phase, or I'll, as you'll see in a sec, I'll grab a couple of 3D models, or in this case just one, for her guns. But it's not that I need them; it's that it just speeds me up, which is it's a good habit to get into if you're willing to learn a little bit of 3D software, or even just go on Sketchfab and screenshot some stuff. As long as if it's fan art, then go for it. If you're working on your own thing, make sure you're allowed to use it. And, I got a huge library of 3D models that I bought, which means that, you're allowed to use them. And you're helping other creators out, too. So here's those SMGs that we're going to throw in there. These are actually different screenshots of slightly different angles. But as you'll see in a second, I realized that, what? This one angle that I'm about to draw, I'm just wrapping the fingers around this... these enormous robotic fingers around this gun that was not meant to, to fit them, but whatever. I figured out that the pose and even the hand pose for this first gun that I'm drawing was actually good enough for the other side too. So in a second, and as you can see as well, I'm not necessarily copying every detail. I'm getting some of it down, but I'm also adding my own little spin on it. You add a little barrel there just to make sure it looks enough like the gun in the show. And here I started to draw the other one, but I was like, wait a second, hold on. This is so similar to the other one. Screw it. Copy paste. Done. Redraw parts of the hand. Manipulate it. Maneuver it. And wham bam. Holy crap. Other gun's done. Hooray. And I believe that is it for her, at least for now. Final character that we got to get in is the Smasher, who... Actually, I think I'm messing with some silhouette stuff here. Yeah, there we go. So, Mr. Smasher. Probably... I think he might be my personal favorite character from the show. I don't know how you guys feel about that, but too bad. I like him. I very, very much liked what they did with his design in the show, because I wasn't the biggest fan of his design in the game, simply because it was kind of one of those sort of classic ArtStation, lots and lots of greeblies, lots and lots of details. And he looked menacing, and he had a scary voice, and he was lots of fun, but I absolutely love what Trigger did with his design. Which is the same design. The proportions are the same, the shapes are the same, but the simplification that they did, and just that cartoony, bendy, anime kind of look they gave him, holy crap! It was, it's just that I think it appeals to me more, the simplification and the just the ability to draw something that's a little bit more simplified. It lends itself better to a more dynamic look. So I very much enjoyed adding him to the top right corner of this piece. And as with some of the other characters, I am drawing far more than is going to be shown, again, because he didn't change position a lot. In fact, he probably changed the least out of everybody, just because he's the largest, and it just so happened that... I think... Did I scale him down here? I guess we're about to see. No, I didn't. He pretty much stays the same. And here I'm adding his missile launcher on the correct side of his shoulder, which is actually shown in the show. I may have intended to only show one when I had done the thumbnail. I can't quite remember. But when I was at this point in the piece, I realized, you know what, just add two. Because although, it doesn't appear in the show, whatever, I'm going to take some creative liberty. Because, there has to be something original in this fan art piece. And also, it's just cool. It also helps to show off the weird fisheye perspective that's going on up there, with one sort of staring towards us and then the other missile launcher. It's pointing in the same direction, but it's pointing slightly, maybe 15 degrees away. So it definitely helps to get across that slight, almost bent perspective that we're seeing up there. So at this point, all of the characters that I had intended to get in are in, and now what I'm doing is I threw in a background color. It's yellow because, of course, it's Cyberpunk. And I'm throwing in a couple of main colors for Atom Smasher simply because he only has a few. At this point, though, I took a step back and I sort of thought to myself, wait a sec. We're missing like another 3 or 4 characters. We're missing the rest of the crew. And it's not that I don't like them, but I just hadn't intended to stick them into the piece. And when I sat there and thought to myself, you know what? We need to get everybody else in. I think we can fit them. It's going to take some doing maybe, but you know what? Let's do it. So here I am, without even doing a rough, I was just like, screw it. You know what? We got reference. Let's go for it. I'm drawing Pilar, what his name is? Rebecca's brother, I think. And I am being a little bit lazier with how much of the pose that I finish, because he's so far back and he's so much smaller that most of him is going to be obscured by other characters that I've drawn anyway, so I'm deliberately not finishing his pose, unlike what I did with the other guys. So he's in. I think I may have had to move Lucy there to make sure that there was some room. Perfect. And I think I may have missed the recording for this, but I also have added Dorio, and I believe her name is Kiwi, on the right side. Slightly less dynamic poses, but they're in, and they'll definitely look pretty good towards the end. So at this point, I've taken a single color layer and I've clipped it down to David's original silhouette layer, and now I'm adding all of his base colors. And same thing for Lucy. And again, the layer stack for this is quite simple. You throw down a silhouette layer, and you just make it a gray, you can make it red, you can make it whatever you want, as long as it's clean and as long as it's under the line layer. Then what you do is you throw in basically as many other layers as you want on top of it, and as long as they're clipped down, they simply will stay true to the silhouette, because that's how Photoshop works. Now we're getting into Main's color, and again, because he's so close to camera, because he's big, because he might or might not move later in the composition, I'm just basically doing everything, even things that will definitely be obscured later. The other thing you have to think about when you're doing a very large-scale illustration like this is you might be able to use these characters for something else. I don't know what that might be. Maybe you post them individually on social media, split the thing up into multiple posts. Perhaps maybe I'll do that. But as well, if they're fun to draw, you may as well just draw them. So now we're getting some stuff in on Rebecca. We're coloring her guns the way they need to be colored. I remember having to actually go back to the scene itself and check like what color were those guns. And now we're throwing in some color on Dorio, and I don't think I even drew the jacket. I think I just did it with color. And now we're doing Kiwi. And now Kilar. He's such a fun character. I love his weird bendy arms and his hand upgrades that he gets in the mail. Or he gets them right from David, I think. So now I took a very long step back and just stared at the piece for a while, because I've thrown in my initial colors. They're not all that clean yet. But what I like to do about halfway through a piece, especially when I'm at this point, whether it's rendered, whether it's painted, whether it's realistic, whether it's anime, doesn't matter. I just stare at it and I go, okay, are we cool with this? Is this looking okay, even at this point, which is a bit of a mess? I decided the answer was yes, and so we are now moving on to the... I'm not going to call it the final cleanup phase. What we're doing is all the stuff that I forgot to do in the original initial line art pass phase. We're cleaning up some lines. We are adding some what looks like occlusion shadows, and we're getting him ready to basically go through the rest of the process. We're going to be adding black shadows. We're going to be doing a two-tone pass. We're going to be doing some entertainment lighting from both sides. And he's going to look pretty sick by the end of it. So here's those black shadows that I was talking about. And it doesn't really matter when you add this. You could do the two-tone first. You could do this first. This was actually a test just to see what the look would be, and so I just did it on this guy. Because number one, because he's the central focus of the piece, the center of the composition, the thing that I want people staring at most, the main character of the show, etc., I made sure that he had by far the most contrast. he had the smallest little shapes because if you want people staring at something, then all you have to do is use all the rules of composition to kind of get that across. One of the things you can do is contrast, which means black versus lighter tones. You can do smaller shapes. You can make the pose super dynamic. You can make it not dynamic at all. As long as it's different from everything around it, and as long as it's front and center, or maybe throw a light shaft or something on it. Those are all different ways that you can get people staring at what you want them to stare at. And at this point, I was like, well, we need to make sure even though our lighting is somewhat unrealistic, we have to keep it consistent. So we are going to just splotch that black shadow on his face, and we're not going to look back. Here I lost a little bit of footage, but I'll explain what happened. What I'm doing to Lucy right now with the two-tone is exactly what I did to David, only his is a slightly different tone because I think it looked a little bit better on his jacket and his pants. The two-tone shade that I'm using for her is a bit more blue, whereas his is a bit more purple. And I'm going through and also cleaning up some of the lines and some of the color areas on her as well at the same time, just to make sure that things are kind of looking good at this point. It's a long, slow process to slowly clean things up and slowly put it together. And one thing that you'll notice on her as well is that David is absolutely covered in black shadows, but with both Maine here and Lucy, who I was drawing before, they have far fewer black shadows, and that's because I want less contrast on them. I want all eyes basically focused on David, then your eye jumps to Maine, then your eye jumps to Lucy, and then further up all the way to Smasher, who then brackets the piece and brings your eye all the way back down to David. And then hopefully your eye doesn't go past him all the way to the bottom, but don't worry, we've got compositional elements coming up that will prevent the eye from going off the bottom of the page too. And I think at this point I was fairly satisfied with the placement of the characters, and so rather than work on them in isolation, as for example, getting rid of David and Lucy, now all the rendering on Maine is only what we can see because I'm pretty confident he's not going to move, and he's also about as large as he needs to be. And so if we are not going to see it at this stage, and maybe if I want to use it later, I'll go back and finish some stuff if I want to show a character individually, but at this point where everybody is where they're going to stay, and so I'm only rendering and coloring and cleaning up what is shown here. Same thing on Rebecca. I'm using even less black shadows this time. Most of her rendering is coming from the two-tone. Same thing with Kiwi. She's actually because she's on the side of the page, I decided to use some of her rendering and body shapes and black shadows to kind of almost bracket that side in a way. That's, I guess, kind of the best way I can put it across. Couple black shadows going in. It's looking like a little bit of a mess right now, don't worry, because I have a few compositional and atmospheric perspective tricks that we can get to separate the characters. What I just did there, you guys may want to pay attention to, because I just did a series of adjustment layers, and now I'm staring at the piece for a little bit again to make sure that they worked. One adjustment layer was for saturation and vibrance, the other one was for lightness and contrast, and I think the other one was a color adjustment pass. I like to do those about halfway through the coloring and rendering portion of a piece. And then what I do is I just render underneath the adjustment layers, but I can still see what the adjustment layers will do to what I'm doing to the layers underneath. It kind of helps to get a better sense of what the piece is going to look like at the end, even though we're nowhere close, although we're definitely closer than we were before. And same thing on Pilar. He's got a couple more black shadows than the other characters, but his a lot of his tones are darker. And same thing with Smasher. He's got a few more blacks. What I actually learned something here about a layer called color burn, or a layer style called color burn. What color burn does is it, depending on the color that you use and depending on the tones that you're painting over, it will actually give you free black shadows and your two-tone colors all with the same layer type. I just didn't know about it. And as you can see, I'm not changing the layer, but when I paint on his sort of lighter face skull mask, it's coming out as blue, but when I paint on his much darker parts, it just comes out as black. So it's a fancy way to save time without actually having to make an extra layer. Keeps your file size slightly smaller, so I think I'll be using that in the future, if it works, because in some instances it may not show up that well or work that well. It really depends on what the initial color tones are and what the color that you happen to use is. So here I'm going in and I'm definitely starting to... We're over 2/3 of the way through by far. I'm starting to add a little bit of atmospheric perspective, and I'm starting to mess with the background color and rendering Pilar's leg, which I forgot to do. I'm going to add some some blurred after images of David behind him, which will really help to pop him out. I don't think that was recorded, but I'll point them out when they happen. And I'm also starting to use a little bit of haze and bring the background tones into the background characters, if you know what I mean, just to push them back, further back than the characters that are closer to camera. And I'm also now taking some of that yellow background tone directly into Atom Smasher, and I think I probably also add it to Rebecca and a few others. So here I lost a bit of my recorded footage, but as you can see, I've added those after images of David behind him, which is, it's good because it fits what he does in the show, and it also is a really, really good compositional element because it gives him a little bit more movement than he actually has. And at this point, I'm now moving into the final stages of cleanup. I'm giving him a couple of highlights, not too many, and then I tone them back because I wasn't really liking the look. And I'm giving him a couple of extra little light shapes as well to pop out more of his forms. And if you guys notice, these are rim lights that I'm doing, but I'm doing them in a very, very planar shape-based way, so they sit on top of forms as opposed to just going along the side of the drawing. What that really helps to do is it makes him look 3D, even though he's a 2D character, you know, is obviously a drawing. But the way that you place your lights is going to make them, you know, either look flat or it's going to make them look like a 3D-ish kind of character. At this point, what I could do is I could turn the lines off and we could just render these guys to a semi-realistic finish, but that's not what I'm going for. It's not even really what I like doing anymore. So, and this is kind of all you need. If you like this look, if you like this really bold anime comic booky looking look, you don't need to go any further. You don't actually need to do any more rendering. And now we're doing a little bit of cleanup work on Lucy. We're adding back in some lines. We're toning up some lines. We're toning down some lines. And I'm staring at some stuff again. Now we're going in and we're cleaning up Maine. A little bit of hair detail here and there. And also, one thing that you guys may want to consider is how much detail you have to draw in this particular style, or in any, you know, style that relies on lines. Maybe consider how much you draw versus how much you can get across using two-tone shadows or black shadows or highlights or anything else. Because you could render it, you could crosshatch it, you could paint it, or you could just, you know, throw it in with a couple of two-tone shadows. Gets the same point across, but it's simpler. Now we are really starting to reach the end. We're rendering out this car a little bit, which I forgot to do, but it's more of an end stage thing anyway. And at a certain point, yeah, there we go. We're going to add the reflection of the whip, which I'm just using a couple of lasso layers to transform it. I'm also going to take the bottom of David's legs, and I'm going to apply them as a reflection on the window. Then I'm going to take a bit of the glowy after-image color tones from the Sandevistan effect behind him and throw those in as well, so it really is a true reflection. And then at this point, I'm throwing in a bunch of screen tones and a bunch of compositional elements that are literally just paint splotches in the bottom, just to make sure that as people's eyes drip down or drift down towards the bottom of the canvas, they kind of run into that, and then you go right back up. Otherwise, you start to lose people. And the screen tones help with some extra texture that we really didn't need to do any extra work for. It's just in the background. And now I'm doing the final cleanup on everybody. Just making sure that the lines are where they need to be, and the black shadows are working. It's balanced. It's good to go. And here we go. It's the end of the illustration. And I hope you guys learned something. If you guys have any questions, leave them in the comments. And appreciate you guys showing up. Thanks a bunch, and I will see you guys all next time.